So now we're on to the world of work this week, uh, which is, I'm sure you, if don't know from personal experience, have heard that it's a highly gendered area. It's an important institution, and that's a key point about this subject is that work in and occupations are institutions, the whole economic system that they are involved with. And it's a primary place where gender is, both acted out and certainly reinforced. And a good example of this is to think about, what you wanted to be as a child. I don't know if you remember, did anybody ever tell you what you wanted to be when you grew up, when you were a child? And, many young children are told, "Oh no, you can't do that. That's a boy's job or that's a girl's job." So it's basically telling you you can't be what you want to be due to gender. So it's a very important area to help us understand how important the separation of the spheres that we've talked about now for a couple of chapters, the separation of spheres, how that concept created this division between home and work, and we've talked a lot about that too, and what the implications are for gender. So as we've seen, that separation of the spheres affected families very much and very strongly by removing some of the elements of what of productive work that families had done together on farms or um, blacksmiths, barrel makers, tinsmiths, everyone. It all took place at the home place, and if not in the home, in the case of weavers, and so there was not that separation. But when it got separated, it had very strong and powerful gender implications in that separation. Uh, so in Anglo-European societies like ours, it created a whole new sphere. Remember, we're talking about separate spheres here. It created a whole new sphere that didn't exist before, and that was the workplace as separate from the home, someplace you left the home and went to do your work, rather than the work being all of a piece in the home place. And then this, in turn, changed the way many people thought about work, of course, very differently. And it became primarily something that was done outside of the house, and it was done for pay. That's another thing. Uh, so, what is work? Well, of course, it's a variety of things, and it really depends on where you live, the culture you live in, because in many places, women work alongside men, either in the fields or they're the primary producers of food or other items that are crucial to survival. In the Mayan culture, women's weaving supports much of the family in terms of selling their beautiful weavings, but they also, the workers in the home provide clothes for the family. So it's, and then another aspect to this is that in some cases, as I said, the women are the primary producers of food, but they also work in jobs that we think of as non-traditional in many cultures, including construction and building. And they're called, the women who work in construction and building in Japan are called the dokata. And you can read more about them in the chapter, of course. So that seems pretty strange to Americans, because if you ask most Americans to guess the gender of a construction worker, they're of course going to say that it's a job for men because men are, have men's overall greater strength. So now we're going to talk a lot about research and statistics and things like that. How do we get those? How is work studied, actually? The workplace, larger economic things, and that type of thing. So the UN and the International Labor Organization actually measure the amount of work and the kinds of work that are done by people in different countries. And there's some evidence that suggests that there's really an important link between the economic growth of a country and its betterment and the employment of women. So that when women come into the workplace in countries, that we are the least industrialized countries, it raises the whole standard of living for their families and the country. But however, an important point here is that a lot, if not most, of the work around the world is in what's called informal labor, which means there's no legal contract for the work done. There's not necessarily an hourly wage or salary. And a key point is that none of that work is reported to the government. So yeah, it's great to keep statistics that the UN and the International Labor Organizations do, but they're missing an enormous amount of the actual work that's being done because it's not reported. So, and of course, women are more likely worldwide to be employed in the informal labor market. In the US, it's actually the same in many ways because women's labor is likely to be less secure than men's in terms of contracts for jobs or commitments, that type of thing, and that often increases women's vulnerability as it does in the least industrialized nations. So for example, some of these statistics are just amazing. We'll dig into them a little bit deeper as we move on. In the US, 92% of domestic workers are women, 57% are Black, Hispanic, Asian American, or Pacific Islander. So almost all, 92% of domestic workers are women in the United States, and more than half, almost 60%, are women of color. Of the 76 million domestic workers worldwide, 76% are women. And because these kinds of jobs are behind closed doors in homes and places like that, almost 30% of the women don't have any kind of labor rights, and half don't even earn the minimum wage. That's in both the US and internationally. So the work that these women do is called vulnerable labor. And that's for several reasons that we're going to talk about why it's vulnerable labor. First, they're lower paid than jobs in the formal economy. The formal economy are those jobs that people are paying taxes on them. You get a paycheck with, that tells you how much per hour you're making, etc. In addition, the vulnerable jobs usually don't have any access to basic social services, while at the same time, they're likely to cause more illness, property loss, disability, and death, which we've seen also in other chapters, previous chapters. So, and that's because the workers aren't actually officially employed, they're not eligible, or they can't afford things like health insurance, home insurance, disability insurance. And then one more thing, in addition, they have the women who do these types of jobs, because remember, they're predominantly women, have lower levels of health, education, and longevity than those who work in the formal economy. So, and then on top of all of that, no country keeps track of the quote housework. That's the kind of stuff that all of us of gendered female people do, that women do in their calculations of economic activity. Remember, we talked about the second shift, okay? That's the type of thing there are guesstimates and some research done on how many hours, as we saw last week, women work more than men doing work in that second shift. You come home from your job and you cook dinner and you check with the kids' homework, you wash dishes, all do the laundry, et cetera, et cetera. We've talked about this. That's what the second shift is. And so there's no country that keeps actual track of that type of thing, housework that women do. So almost all the tasks that fall under the umbrella of housework can be and often are outsourced. So if you have the money to do that, then those can be, you can hire those domestic workers for less than minimum wage that we just talked about. You can even outsource the emotional and intimate job of raising children, because that's often done by people that are employees, like in the informal labor market, employees, nannies, babysitters, and au pairs. Uh, so you could see that the person doing all of these things for free, often the mother or the female in the household, on top of her job, she's doing them as part of the second shift or as her only job, but still for free. She's saving the household a great deal of money by not calculating her worth. There were actually some studies done and in calculating the worth of what mothers do, or wives and mothers do in the household, uh, the ones that don't work in a job and just do that. It was around 100,000 a year. And the New Yorker magazine had an article several years ago about a new trend in New York City about uh, wives for hire. So in two earner, these are very high earner families in New York City, what they do is they hire someone to be the wife, to do everything that the wife who was a stay-at-home wife would do. And they were making very, very large salaries, the women that they were hiring to do that. So in getting back to childcare costs, right? If you're working in the U.S., the monthly childcare costs in a center-based facility is $1,230. So that adds up to $14,760 a year. For in-family childcare, the cost is around $800 a month. And then the family who makes the median middle income in the United States spends an average of about 18%, almost 20% of their income on child care for an infant. It's more, of course, expensive for an infant, and about 13% of their income for a toddler. Now, this is really interesting. Mothers who have never been married, unmarried mothers, spend 23%, almost a quarter of their income, on child care. And married mothers spend only about 9%, which let's round it up to 10%. And that has to do with the income of the family, because unwed single moms, these are mothers who have never been married, and they're usually in much lower paying jobs, which is why they're spending a quarter of their income on childcare. The very poorest of the families spend up to 35% of their income on childcare. Now remember, the cost of childcare stays pretty stable whether you're making, a lot of money or hardly any money, like the poorest families. So that's why the percentages for the poor families is greater of what they spend on childcare. So here's the question: why then is childcare treated as if it's not part of the real economy when it's done by family members? Why is that not something one gets some kind of, say, tax credit for back, the amount of childcare that family members do? And because, here's the answer, which fits right in with the subject of this class, work is a very gendered institution, as we'll see. Just as the world of the family is considered a feminine domain, the world of work is considered a male domain. So the work that women do in the house, that there's no recompense for in any way, financially, well, that's just part of being a woman and with part of a household or part of a family. So now we're going to look at masculinity and work, a man's job. Okay. So work for men, than being invisible, like so much of the work that women do is invisible, okay, rather than being invisible for a man, it becomes an unspoken expectation. And that expectation of work for men is often defined as the very core of a man's identity or male identity. Because in almost any industrialized nation, men are expected to have jobs. That's the norm. And any deviation is often seen as not just a personal failing, but a failure of his masculinity. So a man, and I'm sure you've all seen how this operates in the world of work, uh, within your families or with your parents, your fathers. Um, a man who's successful in the world of work is also viewed as being successful at being a man. And in the US, we even have sayings for that. The bigger the paycheck, the bigger the man. Remember in a previous chapter, in other words, be a big wheel. So if that's the case, and research seems to validate over and over that that's the case, masculinity and a man's work are intimately entwined with his presentation of himself as a functional, competent male person. What happens to men who don't work or whose work doesn't meet the status of a big paycheck? Well, as you might imagine, there's a lot of sociological research about what happens to men uh, whose lives are characterized by different kinds of failure. Whether it's actual unemployment, they've done lots of research on unemployed men, or whether it's working class jobs that don't pay very much and don't have any status. And what the research has found is that those types of events, losing your job or having a job that doesn't make much money and has no status, it really affects these men's relationships, sometimes ruining friendships, putting a strain on the relationships between husbands and wives. And it also it alters patterns of fatherhood. One study found that when you ask men to talk about their identities, usually the first thing they talk about and describe is their job or what they do for a living. So it's such a huge part of male identity. Now, when you look at women's work and why they don't identify themselves immediately as what they do for a job, women's work identity is much more complex because it's composed of competing interests, which include family obligations and those other parts of their lives that we had talked about. For men, though, the work represents kind of the core of their lives. So they feel that the job is part of who they are as actual people and as men. Interestingly, the study found a sense of loss and helplessness experienced by men who have lost their jobs, not through any fault of their own, due to layoffs or other company-based issues. Some said that they were afraid to sit still, and they kept busy doing things around the house for fear that they would, quote, never get up again. Or that this is an interesting one too. Or conversely, that they have not earned the, quote, right to sit still since they're no longer employed. So, to come home, put your feet up, relax with a beer or whatever, they can't do that when many of these men felt that they shouldn't be doing that because they were unemployed. So, although in this study, they were usually part of mass layoffs, so say, a factory had closed or something, and and therefore, of course, they were victims of much larger macroeconomic trends, they still frequently blamed themselves, even though the layoffs, once again, were company-wide, part of larger economic trends. Because often men who've lost their jobs feel they've not lost just a job, but a whole way of life. And that's especially true since, as we learned in another chapter, many of their friendships are based on their work. Unfortunately, when this happens to men, many of them become violent. They turn to alcohol or other drugs to cope with feelings of depression. Uh, Children in these studies have described their fathers as suddenly always being mad and unapproachable. And even their sexual lives are affected by the result of the anxiety, fear, and depression that they feel from the loss of their job. And as we talked about, from their identity at the same time. Okay. So, because work and masculinity are deeply interconnected, men with disabilities, as you might imagine, are either excluded, who are either excluded from work or, negotiate the kind of work they do with a disability. They're also affected, and even more intensely than men who've been laid off or without work. Because if you think about it, even the phrase, quote, disabled man is a self-contradiction, since men by definition are supposed to be able, strong, and powerful. How does this affect disabled men in the workplace? Well, as you might imagine, in the United States, and I would bet just about everywhere, uh, people with disabilities in general are unemployed or underemployed, one or the other. Okay. Now, some of the European and particularly Scandinavian nations have done a better job with inclusivity and laws that require that. But in the U.S., most disabled men are either unemployed or underemployed. When employed, they're less likely to be in management and professional occupations. And as we just talked about, disability has a greater impact on masculinity than it does on femininity, because remember this from another chapter too, masculinity is continually contested, primarily by other males. So you're constantly in need of proving your masculinity to one degree or another. Because remember, in the hegemonic masculinity, as a theory, says that the ideal form of masculinity is impossible to obtain. But power is distributed among men according to how close one comes to the ideal. So men with disabilities do not come close to the ideal at all of being this powerful, perfect male. And so they become an example of what's called marginalized masculinity. And they do not benefit from the perks, the patriarchal benefits, as they're called, that other men in the culture do. Because one of the main aspects of hegemonic masculinity is its emphasis, remember this, on independence and autonomy. If you're disabled, you're not generally completely independent or autonomous because you need help to get around. You need wheelchairs, you need nursing help, you need all kinds of help, depending on what your disability is, of course. So that assistance that is required makes both independence and autonomy difficult or impossible to actually create. And then on top of that, work can be an important source of status for men, as we've seen. And that's very often very problematic for men with disabilities, because they either can't get work or the work they get doesn't usually have a lot of status associated with it. So now that brings us to this question of, what about men who are in predominantly female occupations? So this is interesting because it demonstrates something else about status. It demonstrates the ways that the status of a particular job or career is actually determined not by how much it pays or how much authority or prestige is associated with it, but what rather of what gender usually does that job. Isn't that interesting? Because jobs done primarily by women are usually viewed as lower status, especially for men in those occupations. So, for example, the tasks done by doctors and nurses are very, very similar, except for operating on folks, okay? And not all doctors operate on folks. General practitioners are not surgeons, for example. So we're just talking about doctors here, not surgeons. So the tasks done by doctors and nurses and and nurse practitioners are very similar. But doctors, who are predominantly men, are paid more, and they have a higher status than the predominantly female nurse practitioners. So how does working in a predominantly female occupation affect the status and identity of men? Well, research focusing on men's experiences in occupations such as, now think about this, librarians, elementary school teachers, nurses, and social workers, those are all typically female jobs. They found that the white men in those jobs faced very little discrimination in hiring or from their co-workers. And heterosexual men often found an advantage in being able to bond with the other males at work who were typically in supervisory positions or, their bosses. So if you want to get promoted, you're a small percentage of employees as a male, a white heterosexual male in a typically female position, but you can bond with the male supervisors more easily. It's interesting because when they looked at gay men in these situations, they often had to disguise the fact that they were gay. And one of the ways they did that partly was by exaggerating masculine qualities. So within the workplace environment, the white straight men got a status boost from being one of the few men in a predominantly female occupation. Interestingly, and this is very interesting, the stigma of a man working in a male occupation came from outside the job. So the white straight men in a predominantly female job got a boost from being male. But from the people outside the job, from their patients, if they were nurse practitioners, clients, friends, family members even, acquaintances and strangers. Many of those people, from those types of people, patients, parents, their clients, friends, family members, etc., strangers even, many of them got the message that, let's take male nurses for example, that male nurses are gay, male librarians are wimpy and asexual, and male social workers are feminine and passive. See all these stereotypes, right? And this is really a big one. While male elementary teachers are suspected of being pedophiles. Okay, so I hope that you're beginning to see and think about, and if you're working at all, or you can observe, other people who are family members and parents, friends, how gendered the workplace is. It's very, very powerfully gendered. And now we're going to see how that works with what's called the glass ceiling and the glass escalator. So the glass ceiling is a metaphor that refers to the fact that women can get to a certain point and be promoted often to a certain point, and then they hit this invisible roof or ceiling over their heads. That's why it's called the glass ceiling, where they just can't get beyond that. The glass escalator refers to the fact that when men are in non-traditional jobs, they often move quickly upwards. So um, the glass ceiling refers to the fact that even with the amount of progress that women have made in the business world, they're still far less likely than men to have jobs that involve authority over other people and over resources. In other words, they hit this invisible ceiling. The glass escalator is the invisible pressure for men in non-traditional occupations like nursing or elementary school teacher to move up in their professions. So to go back to the glass ceiling, it's both invisible and unbreakable. So it should be the plastic ceiling, maybe, since it's unbreakable, and is a good metaphor for both women and people of color in attempting to obtain higher positions, positions of power within the workplace. Hillary Clinton, as a matter of fact, used the glass ceiling as a metaphor in her concession speech conceding the presidential nomination when she said, quote, although we weren't able to shatter the highest, hardest glass ceiling this time, thanks to you, it's got 18 million cracks in it. So women often face these blocked opportunities, as I said, when they attempt to climb beyond a certain point in a corporate ladder. And of course, there's greater earnings the higher you go up the ladder. So that's one of the reasons women's earnings are rarely compare with men's in a general, when just looking over women's work and men's work. And although it's often difficult to describe the situation of people of color in the corporate world, this term, the glass ceiling, it's not primarily used for women of color. It's primarily a term used to describe women's experiences in general of whatever color in a male-dominated corporate world. So now let's move on to the glass escalator and see how that works for men men who are working in typically female occupations. In quotes. Do they face the same kind of disadvantages as women in the glass ceiling metaphor? Well, I've already given you the definitions for those two things, so you know that's not true. The answer is no. Female librarians actually had a preference for hiring males over females. And male elementary school teachers were more marketable because of their gender. Once these men were hired in their professions that hired them and wanted to hire them, they were often tracked into areas of specialties with more responsibility, with higher pay, things like administrative jobs. But the glass escalator doesn't work for all men because gay men and men of color did not receive the benefits of the glass escalator that their straight white counterparts did. All right, let's look at sex segregation in the workplace and how that came about. So, how did occupations such as social worker, nurse, elementary school teacher, and librarian become predominantly male in the first place? Female, excuse me. How did they become predominantly female in the first place? And why are some occupations like CEOs and senators and presidents predominantly male? Well, we've already discussed a division of labor in a previous chapter. But when you look at the world of work, there's a whole new category, and it's called occupational sex segregation. And that is the concentration of women and men into different jobs, different occupations, and different types of firms. And it exists in many cultures to one degree or another. Okay? So it isn't just US culture or Anglo-European culture, but it's more obvious and strong in US and Anglo-European culture. So in the US, we use sex segregation, for instance, for most public bathrooms and locker rooms. But interestingly, as we'll see, because other countries do, not in the bathrooms in our homes. In some cultures, sex segregation is enforced in family homes, and women are excluded from certain areas and men are confined to others. If you think of some very traditional Muslim cultures, you will find that. So, harem is a good example. So, when referring to sex segregation in the subject of work, the focus is not only on physical space, but on how whole career paths become dominated by either men or women. So, in places like the United States, you might assume, because we have affirmative action programs, you might assume that we've kind of taken care of that or at least made a dent in it through affirmative action, which prevents discrimination against women and people of color, especially in occupational segregation. But the rates of occupational sex discrimination and occupational segregation by race are still very high in the United States, and they really are part of our taken for granted assumptions. So, taken for granted means they're almost unconscious. We don't consciously think about that's a job for women or that's a job for men and sex segregation by occupation in that way. They're just taken for granted assumptions that we don't even really need to think about. Here's some examples. In the United States, less than 10% of people working have a worker or a colleague of a different gender who does the same job for the same employer on the same shift for the same pay. Only 10%. Now, I want to tell you something, that there are professions that are a little bit different, and higher education is one. So, in general, at SWOC or other universities, there's a lot of people of all genders doing the same job. I'm thinking about instructors now, teachers, professors, the same job at the same time in the same place for the same pay. Like, our offices are all in a building, together. They're not segregated by gender, et cetera, et cetera. So, but the ways that that's not true of most employment. And there's a lot of different ways that women can be segregated. One is by the shift they work or the locations that they're placed in, where, either is it in an office? Is it at the headquarters where all the CEOs are, for example? And also for the employer for whom they work and the actual job they do. And that's why I mentioned universities. It's different in different amounts of sex segregation in different jobs. Okay. So with all of these factors involved, very few men and women work with people of a different gender who are doing exactly the same job. Also, let's think about college counselors, for instance, are both, you're going to find male counselors and female counselors doing exactly the same job. And that is actually kind of rare in the workplaces you're seeing, because of the 66 million in the United States doing paid work, 30% of them, 1/3 almost, work in just 10 of the 503 occupations listed in the U.S. Census. So there's 503 jobs listed in the U.S., and a third, virtually, we're rounding up, a third of women work in only 10 of those jobs out of 503. Okay, so that's what I'm just saying. Another way of saying it, I'll turn it around. Is it a third of all women are concentrated in 10 out of hundreds of occupations? When you add race to the picture, 18% of all Latinx women work in just 5 occupations, which has an annual salary average of about $23,000 a year. 14%, now think about this, okay? 18% of all Latinx women work in just 5 occupations that pays an average of $23,000 a year, while 14% of white men work in 5 occupations with an average salary of $60,000 a year. 51%, so about half of Asian Americans or Pacific Islander women work as manicurists, earning an average of $21,000 annually. So, if you pay attention in restaurants and coffee shops, for example, is there a gender pattern next time you're in one of those places, or any workplace, but the book is suggesting restaurants and coffee shops? Is there a gender pattern to who is more likely to be serving your food and who is more likely to be cooking it? Generally the kitchen's pretty male, okay, and the servers are usually pretty female. What about all the teachers you had during your school years? How many male teachers versus female teachers did you have? What subjects did they teach? What gender changes the oil in your car or sold you your car? And apropos of this, I want to tell you that I was so thrilled at the North Bend Les Schwab. They have a woman who's actually working with the guys changing tires, and she is changing the tires, and it was just amazing to see a woman back there. All years I've been going to Les Schwab, there was never, the women are there, but they're in the they're in the front when you come in and do the billing and answer the phone and that type of thing. So that was great. So it's easy to see why many, if not most occupations, only 50, for example, this is really true, this gender segregation. In most occupations, for example, only 15% of police officers in the United States are women. Yet they've done research after research that shows that when there's a woman police officer with a male police officer in a situation that could get very scary, the hostility rates come down. There's less actual violence that occurs, and yet there's still only 15% of women in the police force. Okay, in the United States. So there are also 2 different levels of sex segregation that focus on 3 levels of analysis at each level. So this gets maybe a little bit confusing, but read your chapter and go through and you'll see how this plays out. So there's, once again, 2 levels to sex segregation with 3 units of kinds of analysis at each level. So the first level of sex segregation is occupational sex segregation. And that's just, as we've talked about, the concentration of women and men in different occupations. So the categories are from the US Census, and there are examples like college and university teacher, truck driver, cook, salaried manager, cashier, nurse's aide, orderly, secretary, guard, bookkeeper. That's just a few of the 503, but those are some examples. But the point is that it gets complicated because a salaried manager at a fast food restaurant is very different from a manager at a prestigious law firm or advertising firm in New York City. So they're all listed as managers, but actually how similar are they really, are the jobs to each other? But even given that, the research is easiest to do at that level, at the occupation level, because it's so broad and it's not very detailed. Now, job level segregation focuses on the specific positions that workers hold within specific establishments. So it gets much more drilling down on what's actually going on. It's a more finely tuned analysis, but it's harder to come by because the research is so much harder to do. One study found that using this level of analysis, occupational sex segregation is actually much higher than had previously been thought. But whichever level one uses, it's apparent that the workplace in the US is very highly segregated along both gender and racial lines. So let's look at gender and dangerous work and the protective labor laws that came out of that. So, one of the reasons that you're much less likely to find women doing the most dangerous jobs, like the ones on the kill floor of slaughterhouses, as we've talked about, is the history of labor legislation during the early years of industrialization, so like in the 1900s. And protective labor legislation argued that women shouldn't work too many hours or do certain jobs because of the detrimental effects on women's health and their ability to perform their crucial household duties and unpaid work as wives and mothers. So, what the effect of that ideology and those laws were was that women were gradually prevented from working in places that, for example, sold alcoholic beverages because it might corrupt their morals. This is when I was very surprised about. They were also prevented from grinding and polishing metals because it would clog their lungs. Well, the irony is, of course, that's true, but it also clogs the lungs of the men who are approved to do that work. Okay, so other legislation, other than the health and safety regulations, was not about the types of work that women could have, but on the working conditions. The most common was the length of the workday. So changing 10-hour days to 8 was one thing that occurred, claiming that women were physically weaker than men and desperately in need of this protection because of their, quote, special physical organization. So that reduction in hours that occurred at this early on point of legislation just for women, men still had to continue working 10 hours a day. So the 8-hour day originally was just for women. And that benefited married women at the same time that many of them were entering the labor market in force after World War I. However, a major problem with the protective labor legislation for women was that it assumed that all women were mothers and wives and needed to be protected in that role. And that had the convenient effect, kind of sarcastically convenient effect, of reducing their overall earnings. Because remember, they could only work 8 hours instead of 10. They could only work certain jobs, generally, which paid less than men. So it reduced their overall earnings, and that in turn excluded women from better paying jobs. So that's the early history, part of the early history of industrialization in the United States and England in particular. And what it did was it actually created competition between men and women for jobs. And that continues today in our contemporary labor markets, that competition for jobs. Now, during the 1970s, even with the progress from the women's movement and women's moving into some predominantly male occupations, just if, only, I don't know, half maybe of the 537 occupational categories saw an increase in women of at least 9%. And that isn't very much. So maybe half of the jobs that are available that are listed in the United States, that 537, with the legal changes to help women move into jobs, only about 10% change occurred. But as women moved into male occupations, the ones that they did move into, the 10%, there was, guess what, a gender turnover in those occupations. This is really interesting how certain jobs flipped from being considered male jobs to female jobs. So listen to this. In 1970, women were 33%, only 1/3 of all personnel, training, and labor relations specialists. By 1980, they were 47% of those. By 1988, 59%. And by 2005, they made up 71%, to remind you, of all personnel, training, and labor relations specialists. Now, when they looked at as another example, insurance adjusters, examiners, and investigators, they went up from 30% being women in 1970 to 87% in 2005. Previously, almost all the jobs that we consider predominantly female occupations were once predominantly male ones. So how does this process happen? How does that flip? That as women move into certain positions, they become considered to be women's occupations and not men's. Okay. Well, the simple answer is in the United States, for many years, women were prevented from attending colleges or other training programs. And if you can't acquire the skills and the knowledge for an occupation, then you're de facto prevented from doing it and applying for them. And so the only people who were qualified historically were men. Okay, because those were men's jobs before women could go to college and get the education they needed. In addition, you have to pay men more. So as women are generally willing to accept less pay, and because of the fewer jobs available to them, then you know they're willing, and now the women have the education, they're allowed to get the education, so they have the qualifications for the job, but they know that they'll take less money. They know that women will take less money, and one way employers who want to lower labor costs is to, one of the things to do is to move to an area where there aren't, many jobs, so workers would accept less pay than they would elsewhere. Another option to lower costs for employers is automation, or moving to part-time or home-based workers, which costs less because you don't have to provide benefits. So here's what happens. A study of several occupations that transitioned from predominantly male to predominantly female beginning in the 1970s found that the jobs became available to women because men didn't want to do them. Jobs like personnel manager, computer operator, insurance agent, and real estate salesperson. When men didn't want to do them as the jobs, as a cost-saving maneuver by employers. When the jobs became less skill was required, de-skilled is the term, when the earnings declined, and when autonomy was reduced. So women took the jobs that because they're more desperate for work. So women. This is the 70s, remember. So women took the jobs that had just been made less attractive because they were better paying than their previous jobs. Okay? They weren't paid when they moved into those professions that had been male jobs. They weren't paid the same as men, but they were paid more than the current jobs, the women, than they had. So in this way, the jobs became downgraded that had been previously male jobs to reduce costs, and then resegregating the jobs by gender, which created a strong connection between the type of work and gender. Once a job, this is a really important point, once a job has been converted from a man's job to a woman's job, gender ideology is used to justify that the occupation is inherently suited to women. So for example, let's look at residential real estate agents. In the 1970s is when that began to transition from predominantly male to predominantly female occupation. But here, men didn't completely leave real estate. The business of real estate underwent the process of what's called ghettoization by gender. So what does that mean? Well, what happened was ghettoization happens when lower paid women, quote, women's jobs are separated from men's jobs within an occupation, job, or firm. So as women moved into Residential real estate, which had been men's bailiwick previously in the 70s, men moved into, they didn't leave real estate, they moved from residential to commercial real estate, which paid much more money too, and has, much higher commissions. So that's how ghettoization within an industry happened. The women are in the ghetto of residential real estate, the men are now in commercial real estate, but it's all real estate. So resegregation happens when an entire occupation transitions from one gender to another. And this is really interesting. In a study of occupations that experienced a large shift in the gender of the workers, there are absolutely zero examples of occupations that truly represent the integration of women and men in the same workplace and jobs. There were none. So ghettoization was the most common outcome, and resegregation was another process. But there were no occupations actually achieved a level of integration with equal or close numbers of men and women. Today, for example, electronics manufacturers prefer women to men because they feel that women have greater finger dexterity than men, which is exactly the same argument that was used in the 19th century hosiery factories for that women should do needlework. Other jobs, such as construction, are seen as off limits for women because of the physical strength required. Teaching kindergarten through high school is now considered a job uniquely suited to women in the US because of the flexibility it provides for mothers, because of the time of the workday, school holidays, etc. But in 19th century rural America, it was men's work. Okay? But as there were more and more credentials required for teaching, but teaching doesn't ever pay very well, more women were recruited for the job because they would accept lower pay. And in that way, teaching became the ideal profession for single, educated, middle-class women. For many years, married women were not allowed to teach, and then once you got pregnant, that was it. You didn't teach anymore. So ghettoization exists in education because elementary teaching is seen as women's work that involves nurturing and is lower paid. And then men are, of course, overrepresented as administrators and supervisors. So we're going to move on to the second video now.